welcome to another Institute for Sound Public Policy podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Lynn, and I'm the Institute's Executive Director as well as the founder of U.S. Tech Workers. And today is December 13th, 2024. Friday the 13th, actually. Okay. Well, we got a great show for you. My guest today is Mark Ray Cromer, and he has just finished a book that's a collection of essays that spans the present back to about the year 2000. And the book is called California Twilight, Essays and Memories, The End of the Golden State. And if it sounds a little apocalyptic, well, it is, because many of his stories, many of his essays that he's written is through the lens of immigration and how that is impacting so many facets of our life and lives of Californians over the years. Now, a little bio before I bring Mark on to the show. Mark Cromer is a journalist and investigator who has written about the impacts of illegal immigration for more than 3 decades. His work on the subject has been published in major newspapers across the country. Cromer covered crime and culture for the Los Angeles Daily Journal, Thompson Los Angeles News Group, the LA Weekly, and the Los Angeles Times. Mark also spent more than 2 decades in the field of business intelligence, working for the global giant Kroll and the boutique firm Sapient Investigations. Now, interestingly, Mark is also a second-generation Californian. He was born in the 1960s, came of age in the 70s and early 80s. So he has an amazing perspective on California. And for our audience who are very interested in the topic of immigration, he's able to kind of demonstrate how that has impacted that state and the country for that matter in so many ways. So I'll read this brief excerpt from his prologue. Part personal journey, part reporter's notebook, and part eulogy. The collection of columns and essays that comprise California Twilight also serves as a red light warning to the rest of the nation, and particularly to those states, both red and blue, that still possess the heritage and legacy they inherited from the greatest generation and perhaps still have time to preserve. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here, Mark. As I read in the intro, your perspective is amazing. In fact, we're contemporaries of each other. I lived in Los Angeles, California from the mid-1990s up through 2016, so it ended up being about 20 years in the state. And we probably know a lot of the same people because I got active in immigration later than you did. It was about 2007 when I had met with Governor Dick Lamb to discuss the creation of what then became Progressives for Immigration Reform. But we're going to jump through a lot of rabbit holes on immigration in California. But I hope you and the audience will let me read one more excerpt from your prologue that I think really sets the stage for our discussion today, because I can always tell someone has a critical mind because they're so capable of connecting the dots. And you wrote, immigration is infused into every issue: law enforcement, environmental impacts, education standards and curriculum, housing availability and affordability, labor markets, hiring practices, wage competition, employment sectors, STEM focus, which is science, technology, engineering, and math focused industries, election integrity, unskilled labor prospects, social benefits, taxation, university admissions, public service, and the arts. Where do we begin, Mark? I mean, how did you get started on the topic of immigration? Obviously, you understand it's connected to almost everything, all of our issues today.
Well, sure. And actually, one of the things I do and establish at the opening of the book in the prologue, is I reference the Al Pacino Keanu Reeves film, The Devil's Advocate. There's a great scene, a sequence in there at the end, sort of the penultimate crescendo, as Pacino reveals himself to be Satan. But there's a great line about the law, and he says, "Why the law, Dad?" And Pacino says, "Because the law puts us into everything." And if you look at immigration, what I realized is you can't really have a valid, holistic discussion about any particular issue, be it education, be it environment, be it healthcare, certainly employment, the economy, without dealing with immigration, the issue of immigration. It overlays everything. And really, we need to be clear what we're discussing here, and should have been discussing in this country nationally, in a cohesive, coherent national dialogue over the last really 40 years, is mass immigration. That's what mass migration into the United States is resulting in the impacts that we are seeing today, whether it's the classroom, the emergency room, the courtroom, the boardroom, everywhere. So that's why I decided to really take a collection of my work, Wild Blue Press in Colorado. They're a great little independent imprint, and they curated 36 of my essays and columns over about a 25-year period. It's about 375 pages. And I think it's a nice way to approach it, too, because these columns have been published in newspapers from the San Francisco Chronicle, the Houston Chronicle, the Charlotte Observer, the Washington Times, the San Diego Union Tribune, Los Angeles Times, etc., around the country. And so they're it's a vignette style. Mm-hmm. You can pick and choose and read sort of out of order, and it's still all there, and you get it. You're not lost. And if I may just quickly, one of the things I think California Twilight does rather successfully is provides readers with a peek behind the curtain, a look at what actually transpired in California. Primarily, there's national applications, but in California, that led to the creation of this infrastructure that aids, abets, and protects, as we're seeing now with the incoming second Trump administration, protecting millions and millions of migrants who have no legal right to be present in the United States, let alone on the job sites in the United States.
Wow. So you have an essay titled "Crazy, Just Not Like a Fox. Glenn Beck's personality disorder mirrors our nation's psychosis on immigration." And you wrote, "Beck's simplistic message was as clear as his psychosis. It doesn't matter how many people are coming to America, just so long as they have the proper paperwork." Introducing Altman on a show, Beck immediately stumbled over himself, suggesting that Californians for population stabilization was a sinister name for a think tank. Mark, what is it with this whole, legal good, illegal bad? Just make everyone legal. I mean, what aren't some of these people getting at this point?
Well, sure, and this is an important point to consider, and that is both parties. This is a bipartisan messaging tactic that migrants and immigrants effectively magically they're magical already, according to quite a bit of the people in the media that cover this issue. But migrants become somehow even more magical if they are legally brought to this country versus illegally cross into the country. Now, of course, there's ample reason everybody should be objecting to illegal immigration. But there seems to be this fascination, and it's to the point of where it's become what we would call a truism, that we just repeat, no, legal immigration is great. It's great. It's great. It doesn't matter. 1 million a year, which we take about, I think, 1.5 million immigrants legally cross into the United States on an annual basis as is, which is more than any other country in the planet, particularly in the first world. The idea, and again, this is a bipartisan affair. I heard it on Fox News, certainly over the last several years, where you have analysts or hosts suggesting that we could take up to 5 million migrants annually legally and that would meet the needs of business, and then we could fully secure the border then and do away with this illegal immigration. And that's just crazy. And yes, crazy, not like a fox in Glenn Beck's case. Glenn Beck was one of those guys who was out there quite early and often saying, we really need to have as much migration. In fact, I believe Glenn Beck suggested that the United States should target a population peak of 1 billion people in the United States. America at 1 billion people. That's a goal for Mr. Beck, evidently.
Absolutely insane. No notion that you can't have infinite growth on a planet with finite resources. And I do want to get into discussions on population with you later.
Sure.
But wow, keep going. This is great.
Yeah. Well, and so in particular, in that instance, I believe an old colleague of mine, Rick Altman, had gone on his show, Glenn Beck's show, and he did start in with this shtick that Beck was known for back then. By his own admission, he called himself a rodeo clown, where he opened up by saying, like, Californians for Population Stabilization. That's sort of an ominous title for a group, isn't it? What would be ominous about that? Population stabilization, population sustainability. Maybe it's a little too intellectually deep for Mr. Beck to consider, but these are, I think, are notable metrics that we should be looking at in terms of what is a sustainable population. And if we're looking at population sustainability and quality of life, right? I mean, this is another aspect that is habitually missing in action anytime people are discussing mass migration into the United States. They often talk about the quality of life that the people who are coming into the United States are fleeing. But very rarely do we hear an ample or appropriate conversation about the quality of life impacts that Americans face as a result of this mass migration. And again, across the board, whether it's availability of housing stocks, rents, job competition, you name it. The local city park, the beach, anything like that. Immigration impacts it all. Mass immigration impacts it very dramatically. And yet our leadership, both parties, and the media, and certainly academia, are reluctant, if not outright refuse, to discuss quality of life impacts on the American people.
Wow, absolutely. I want to also, we just talked about quality of life, but employment brings quality of life. It gets you up the rungs of the economic ladder. And in your book, you have a chapter, you wrote this in 2010, and it's, "Hey buddy, can you spare a job?" And you wrote, "These are jobs Americans don't want and won't do. It's gospel." And because you're kind of quoting what people are saying, they're jobs Americans don't want to do, that it kind of morphed into that. Well, they're just doing the things we don't want to do. And then it morphed into when we started offshoring jobs with NAFTA, GATT, and the WTO. It's like, oh, these are jobs that don't have an economic right to exist. Learn to code. And then we started importing all these white-collar workers. For instance, with the H-1B visa program, we bring about 120,000 people in a year just on that one employment visa. And they're replacing Americans that did learn to code because they're cheaper and Americans are expensive and expendable. So what's going on in the labor market with all of this, Mark?
Well, I'd open by saying I think we've certainly seen data that's been coming out over the last several years that virtually the entirety of jobs returning to the economy have been primarily picked up by immigrants. And the actual, native-born Americans lag significantly behind. But in terms of the column, the essay actually, "Hey, buddy, can you spare a job?" What I wanted to do was really put the narrative that had been carefully managed and established throughout the media over decades, that immigrants primarily fill positions and jobs that Americans won't take and don't want. quite frankly, they've said repeatedly that we're American people are just simply too soft and lazy, and they use as their example primarily as the field work in the agricultural industries, the pickers, and Americans don't want these jobs, and they won't do them. And so we have to bring in these hardworking, good, God-fearing migrants that are just pursuing the American dream. It's a very tidy little narrative, but I decided to really explore it a lot more. And in particular, I wanted to go out and start looking for what would be called jobs of last resort. Where do Americans turn to when they don't have particular openings or prospects in their long chosen career field and career path that they had taken? Well, they started taking service industry jobs, right? Delivery jobs. We've certainly seen this with Amazon. What is now called actually side hustles. Get your side hustle on. It's the goof of all time. It's the scam of all time. But I started to explore what actually happens when Americans go apply for these jobs. So I went out, even though I didn't need a job, I went out and applied at a bunch of jobs in industries across a wide array of industries, like parking cars. I was a valet back in my college years at the Grant Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles. I was a fast food cook. I was a server. I was a busboy. I was a delivery driver. Disabled American veterans. I drove truck for them, picked up donations, I across the board. So I went back and I applied at all these jobs, and I could actually genuinely say, yeah, I do have experience in this. I'm filling out an application at Carl's Jr., right? And it's like, yeah, no, I worked for you guys 2 years back when I was in high school. And I went actually back to the same Carl's Jr. I worked at 40 years earlier, and or thereabouts, maybe it was 30 whatever years earlier. Anyway, and it was fascinating to see, and firsthand, what the reaction is by management in interfacing or dealing with an American citizen applying for these jobs, and really being to experience anecdotally what the labor competition actually is by and from immigrants. There were cases like, so in that particular essay, I point out I went to a car wash. And a nearby car wash, they wouldn't even give me an application. They would literally not allow me to apply for the position. We're not hiring right now. I said, great, well, let me give you all my information. I'd like to apply, and if a position opens up, presumably you consider me and give me a call. No, thank you. But Americans simply were not welcome to even apply for the position. There was not one English-speaking guy on that line, not one. And it's brazen, it's blatant, and they carry it out without fear of any enforcement of labor law. That's clear. And so I took that and built an essay around it. Took that investigative work, if you will, and built an essay around it. And also in that essay, I interviewed a woman by the name of Ann Lennon, who was a financial services industry professional who lost her job in the Great Recession that hit in the fall of 2008. And I sat down and interviewed her on several occasions, long discussions about what her experience was. And it was a very frightening and grim situation where weeks turned into months, months turned into years. She wasn't able to land anything successfully in her long established career field, and ultimately ended up working a series of positions just like what I was describing, jobs of last resort. In her case, included being a ticket taker at Anaheim Stadium where the Angels play. And it was grim. It's a very debilitating, emotionally disturbing experience. This I think a lot of people realize we've entered sort of an era of American despair, that the promise and prospects that we once faced in our future are now not just uncertain, but seem to be disappearing in front of our eyes. And that's why California Twilight really talks about the sort of the end of the golden era of the Golden State, what it's become, and I believe likely irrevocably. And then the question is, will this be allowed to happen across the nation writ large?
Yeah, it's amazing. A longtime friend of mine, he's now chairman of our organization, Steve Lamb, who is a fifth generation Altadenan. And we did an incognito interview of a housing inspector. He worked on, he inspected for Los Angeles County multifamily homes that were being built, apartments essentially. And it was amazing because, he had started in construction himself in the 80s. And construction was a good middle class job. And if, let's just say, you end up becoming a contractor and you're bidding jobs and working these jobs, hiring other people, that's an upper middle class income. That's not the way anymore. He was saying, these guys on the line, they're making like $12 an hour flat, no benefits or anything. Most he knows are illegal. You have to be a foreman on a job site, you have to be fluent in Spanish. And the jobs have all been kind of dumbed down to the point where it's like, you're going to staple this, this, and this. So we don't really have skilled tradesmen anymore. It was funny when Steve and I really started like looking at immigration in the 2007, 2008 time period in Los Angeles. We interviewed a guy, and his name was Roman, and he was a tile setter in Pasadena, had a successful business, but he couldn't compete with the people that were working illegally. And he said something really interesting too. He said he got his start, digging ditches, cleaning up shop floors, right out of high school. And that's how you kind of get started in the trades. And then you kind of go into a field that you are more interested in, and then you become the journeyman, eventually an expert in a field, and the unions, the trades. I mean, there's a significant impact there. And what I learned in this journey was that, we have such high rates of unemployment among our American descendants of slaves community, but they were very prominent in California in the trades. Is that correct, Mark?
Well, absolutely. My experience really starting to work, going to the workplace in the late 70s, early 80s, it was a completely, literally a different complexion of worker in manual labor, menial labor, and also trade labor that you could witness. It was a multi-ethnic group of people that were working these jobs. And that beyond even the trades, into hospitality and other landscaping be another example. It really gives reveals the lie when you look back and actually dig into these things. You realize that no, these jobs were traditionally done by Americans of every racial background and ethnicity, and Americans were systematically driven out from them, really by being underbid and pushed out. I think that it's pretty easy to determine or discern why industries prefer a migrant labor force. And certainly wages is a big part of that, no doubt about it. It's foundational. But also the lack of sophistication in terms of what they're entitled to regarding labor law, worker safety, worksite safety, all of
Right.
these things
They're
actually.
not going to sue their employer because they have
Absolutely,
no
a lack
legal
of legal
standing in the country.
there's a lack of legal sophistication, etc. So, and again, this transcends any particular industry or sector. They always feel that a migrant, legal or illegal, feels still somewhat tenuous, I think, in the new country, and so is less likely to make any kind of waves and just be much more compliant, subservient, and get on with what the boss has said to do. And I think you can apply that to tech all the way down to the strawberry field outside of Bakersfield. So, I really think that we've seen in construction, as you referenced, Kevin, um, back in the 70s and 80s, you saw work sites where the framers, the concrete pourers, drywall hangers, roofers, we're essentially, again, a multi-ethnic, multi-racial work base of workers. And after the '86 Simpson-Mazzoli immigration reform bill that Reagan signed,
Right. That
that
was,
opened the
we call that what, the Reagan amnesty, correct?
yes, and that triggered. It was peddled and pitched to the American people as normalizing or regularizing approximately 800,000. I think was the higher end of the population they identified that would be made legal under the terms of the amnesty, and that ended up being more than 3 million. And that actually is a consistent pattern we've seen in our government analysis. If you look back at the Dreamers now, which Trump is talking about, some accommodation will be made or reached, he'd like to cover the Dreamers. Initially, when President Obama began to kick that around, it was going to be several 100,000 uh, uh, beneficiaries. The number started relatively low, I believe, in the six figures.
Right.
Now we're hearing it's what is it now, 5-6 million, something like
Five,
that.
6 million. And the thing is, it actually, the numbers should have gone down because they would have naturally attrited out. Boy
The-
meets girl, they get married, they get citizenship,
yeah,
or they self deport, go back to their home country. And yeah,
and it,
but it keeps going. These numbers keep going up, and we don't even have a good bead on the total number of illegal immigrants. A lot of people prior to the Biden administration, the roughly 10 million or 12 million that came in over the last 4 years, we're looking at least 13 million. But I have seen studies by Ivy League schools that put it as high as 40, and we're probably about 20 million, illegal immigrants in the country now. Certainly, we have the highest
well,
percentage of foreign born in the States than we've ever had.
that's right. That made the front page of the New York Times yesterday. I'll come back to that in a moment, but I do want to say something about what the actual population of migrants illegally present in the United States is. And there's a couple of things about that. First thing that Americans should get a handle on is there is a reason that the government has never wanted to establish with any credibility or any sense of urgency the actual number or the range, a very close approximate range of what the size of the population is. And there's a reason for that. They are scared to death that if it is revealed that there are upwards of 40 million people illegally in the United States as we speak, 40 million, that the jig is up, the mask has fallen, the reality and the depth of the betrayal will be laid bare. And so they want to conceal it. It's important to remember that in 2005, I believe it was, Bear Stearns issued a devastating report that estimated, and it was far beyond what the Census Bureau does. They looked at remittances to foreign countries. They looked at school enrollments. They looked at hospitals. They looked at across a much more holistic sampling of data points to determine what the actual population of illegal immigrants in the United States was in 2005, 20 years ago. And they estimated that number could be over then. It could have been over 20 million. Now, if you just take what has happened under the Biden administration's past 4 years, and you take everything in between, which is significant, there's just no way that the population of illegal migrants present in the United States today is somewhere less than 30 million. It's just, it defies credibility and common sense. The numbers are huge. And that is why the government is scared to death to actually try to legitimately quantify what the numbers are, because they're afraid of the numbers. And there's one other important point I want to make that you can see in California Twilight throughout, is that the media, and this is pretty fascinating when you consider the broad range of the media that we're talking about here, they have kept consistent, and this is a tribute to actual very effective narrative management. That figure of 11 to 12 million illegal immigrants present in the United States today, that has been static for approaching 20 years.
Right. It's kind of
And
like oil reserves in Saudi Arabia.
it's a magical number, man. It never moves.
And we know it does. Now, you
Yeah.
use the word betrayal, and I want to find it here in your book. Here we go. You wrote a chapter called, now this is from 2008, you wrote, "Smear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail," 2008. Candidates Obama and McCain paid tribute to and sell their political souls to the National Council of La Raza. Now, I want to read your quote, and then let's dive down this rabbit hole. A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and he carries his banners openly against the city. But the traitor moves among those within the gates freely. His sly whispers rustling through all the alleys, heard in the very halls of government itself. It's a quote from Pillar of Iron, but it's also sourced back to Marcus Tullius Cicero.
Right.
What is going on with the parties? That, as you said, illegal mass immigration is a byproduct of bipartisanship in this country. What is going on and why?
Well, at the end of the day, I think you can look clearly. The touchstone for this moment is the 1965 Immigration Reform Act of '65 that Ted Kennedy pushed through with Republican support, I should add. In fact,
right,
it only made it.
Right, that was also known as the Hart-Celler Act.
The Hart-Celler Act of '65.
Two guys,
sure.
Hart and Celler, who came up through the Tammany Hall ooze of New York
Right.
State. And, maybe
Ted,
because in 1924, we had basically not closed the door on immigration, but we greatly restricted it because we had gone through that, again, period of mass immigration, and it was really wearing at the country's social cohesion as well as employment prospects. We were basically creating a poor class of laborers across the country.
right.
Unions couldn't get a toehold. So in 1924, Calvin Coolidge signed the Immigration Act of 1924, and it worked very well. Like, for instance, I'm the son of an immigrant. My mother came here from Ireland in 1952. And at that time, it was a good time to be an immigrant in the U.S., and it was a good time to be native born. Immigration was restrictive, regulated, and rare. I mean, she talked about how twice a year she had to appear in front of her immigration officer. And he would check to make sure that she wasn't being a public charge. They took the job serious, and we built the middle class. So I just kind of wanted to give that as a background for our guests too. But please go ahead.
Well, absolutely, and I'm glad you did, because really what that period in America demonstrates by establishing, I'm off the screen, I don't know if you
There we
saw
go.
that.
There we go.
Yeah. What that period of America establishes is the effectiveness of what effectively is a mass migration moratorium, a moratorium on immigration. And if you try to propose that now, Ann Coulter, of course, has talked about it for quite some time, I think absolutely she's on the money with that, is by establishing a moratorium on all immigration, including legal immigration, that the 1.5 or more million immigrants we bring into this country every single year, we need to dial that down to something close to zero for, let's just say, 10 years. Give the country pause, give the country room to catch its breath, give the country a time to nationally begin to assimilate, take stock of its migrant population, and more effectively mainstream them into American society, those who are here and are going to stay, and of course deport those who are not. But a across the board moratorium would be very on all immigration into the United States, all legal immigration, would be very effective in establishing what we wanted to do. And the proof of concept is what occurred back earlier in the 20th century. And that led to, as you pointed out, Kevin, really an unprecedented level of prosperity, particularly in the post-war boom, And that, unfortunately, lasted about 20 years before the beginning, excuse me, the beginning of the end with the Hart-Celler Act in 65, which it's very important to point out that Ted Kennedy, in a speech which you can find, made a point of attacking those who had raised concerns about what the impacts of the 65 Immigration Reform Act would deliver. He said that it was false that the compositions and cohesiveness of America's great cities would be put under pressure or changed. That it was catering to xenophobia, basically. If you said that, look, we have real concerns about shifting up the national quota system and country of origins quota system. And in fact, all of those criticisms have come to pass. Everything that they were worried about in 65, really by 1995, 2000, had already happened. And
Right.
Ted Kennedy,
Even by the early 1970s, we were seeing wages beginning to drop in our more vulnerable communities. And
sure.
Eugene McCarthy, the very liberal senator from Minnesota, wrote a book in the 80s. I don't know if you're familiar with it, called Colony of the World. And in it, he said his greatest regret in the Senate was signing on to the Hart-Celler, the Immigration Act of 1965. Because,
Well, sure.
go for it.
Oh, no. Clean for Gene. I mean, everybody remembers that Eugene McCarthy's one who ultimately. A lot of people think that he beat LBJ in Iowa or New Hampshire, and he didn't. He just came so close within striking range that Bobby Kennedy decided to jump in back in '68. But yeah, no, he was absolutely. Had very clear-eyed, unfortunately, clear-eyed analysis in the rearview mirror of what occurred there. But yeah.
Because his big argument was, look, we have, with the Great Society, there are vulnerable communities we need to bring along. But now, whereas prior to 1965, the majority of immigration came from a more developed European continent, as opposed to many poorer countries. So someone gets here, they're indigent, they're almost automatically able to pull on public support. And that was actually competing against what was being outlined for, or being budgeted for, our more vulnerable communities, to get them up and out of poverty.
Well, absolutely. I think it was, I believe it was Milton Friedman that said or observed, you can have a social services safety net, or you can have open borders. You can't have both. And that's exactly right. In one of the columns that's included in California Twilight, explores the case of Dr. Gene Rogers, who was a Vietnam vet. He was a mass surgeon, and he became the director of Sacramento County's medical director for their indigent services program. Now, think about that. Indigent services program, Sacramento County, state capital in the state of California. A department that was dedicated to providing medical services medical services to the most at-risk, in-need American citizens among us. Well, Dr. Rogers determined shortly after, over a period of years, but after being on the job for a while, that a completely parallel system had been set up within that department, and really throughout Sacramento, to provide medical services, in many cases elective medical services, to illegal aliens, to illegal immigrants, and through his department. So services were literally, in this case, being denied to American indigent, American homeless. And as you certainly know, among that community, there's no shortage of vets who serve this nation. And that's what I think one of the reasons he found it particularly offensive. But this complete shadow system, this architecture, this infrastructure had been created within the bureaucracy to ensure that services that otherwise were going to be denied illegal immigrants were in fact provided to illegal immigrants, all at the taxpayer expense and completely at through denying service to American homeless, American poor, American indigent. It was outrageous. And so I flew up to Sacramento and interviewed him many years ago. But one of the reasons I thought it was so important to include that is in his words, and again, a decorated mass surgeon who served his nation in Vietnam, he really describes the system and the insidious nature of these activists within the bureaucracy. It extends far outside of academia, inside the bureaucracy in the United States and its governing class, that, and again, bipartisan, that have created an infrastructure to cater to and provide services to migrants who have no legal right to be in the nation. And I can assure you, Kevin, the hour, that was almost 20 years ago, the hour is very, very late for the United States.
Yeah, amazing. It's interesting. During that period in the late 19th, early 20th century, we had the mass migration. One of the things people fail to remember is a lot of the immigrants ended up going home. There was no social safety net. And conditions were so bad in our industrial cities. Like if you would come from Greece, it's like, this is awful. And it's funny. I was in Poland in 2014. I was in the city of Krakow and I went on a bicycle tour. And the tour guide had lived in the Bay Area for about 4 years. And I'm like, well, you're back here? He goes, yeah. He goes, all I did was work there. And the food is lousy. The commutes were terrible. I mean, here I have good food. I mean, you've had the bread, right? Oh, yeah, yeah. And he goes, I have my friends. I don't make a lot of money, but I can enjoy life here. I mean, so that really talks about how degraded our quality. You had mentioned quality of life earlier. And I'd like you to go down that rabbit hole. I'd like to preface it with, I have a lot of friends. I lived in California for 20 years. And the ones that I knew that were born and raised there, when they would talk about California, it was almost as if they were homesick for a place they'd never left. The quality of life, because, growing up in Pennsylvania, we would watch the Frankie Avalon and at Bunicello movies. They're out at the beach and then they're skiing on the same day. It just looked like a wonderland. And having been there for 20 years, the quality of life for me, I knew I would never be able to afford a home, to say the least. So I'd like for you to talk about those issues, if you could, Mark.
Sure. And as a second generation native who, believe it or not, I've spent most of my life, I've lived in a variety of other places. Most of my life has been spent with living within 5 miles of the hospital where I was born, which the author Mike Davis, who wrote Planet of the Slums and City of Quartz, great author, he passed away since, but he was, I interviewed him several times, and he was talking about my experience, and he said, it's very, very unique in California to find it's much more of an East Coast old world thing where you're, 50 years later, you're still living within 5 miles of the hospital where you were born. But that is the case with me. And I did have that beautiful experience of growing up in a California that simply no longer exists, and I doubt ever will again. We really did have in the 70s and throughout the 80s, early 80s and into the 80s, there were still so much of a prevalence of the inheritance really from the mid 20th century that was being delivered in so many ways, not just job opportunities and educational opportunities, that too, of course, but in space, in open space. There was, I like to say that city limits back then still denoted actual open space between cities. And the traffic situation, which, Southern California has been dealing with traffic with the arrival of the the 110 freeway in Pasadena, I think it was 40 whatever that
Right.
thing
It was
opened.
what the
Uh,
first quote unquote highway for freeway.
for freeway, yeah, yeah. But in the early '80s, by example, I was a valet at the Biltmore in downtown Los Angeles and attending Cal Poly Pomona in Pomona, and it wasn't anything for me. I worked swing shifts, so from like 6 to 2 or 3 in the morning, 6 at night to 2 or 3 in the morning, and it was no problem for me to drive back and forth, and actually and still carry a full load at Cal Poly Pomona, and just the traffic wasn't what it was today.
I
And what
couldn't
we see,
imagine today doing that commute in a day.
you wouldn't be able to, and you wouldn't be able to. I've commuted from Claremont to Beverly Hills. I've commuted from Claremont to Santa Ana in Orange County, and you can count on now the rush hour is gone. It's no longer rush hour. It is a constant state of excuse me, permanent sludge really on our freeways. The question is, are you going to be going 15 miles an hour for 2 hours, or might you tick it up to 40 miles an hour? But with rare exception, it is a state of effectively permanent gridlock.
Yeah, last
And
spring I was back visiting. I was staying in Santa Monica, and I had to go to downtown Los Angeles. And it was about 2 in the afternoon, and I figured I would be fine with traffic. And I
right,
wasn't. I was stuck
no,
in traffic. It probably added easily 45 minutes to my commute.
the era is gone when rush hour was defined by roughly 7 in the morning till maybe 9, 7 or 8, 8 to 9, and 4 to 5, 5 to 6 when people were getting out of work and going home. That's completely gone. And COVID did scramble, the shutdowns did scramble things, and in some respects actually uh, cleared up some of the freeways for sure.
Okay.
Uh,
Right.
but
I know
but
people that said that. Right.
yeah, but it's back. Even if workers aren't returning to the full scale that they were on site downtown or in commercial office spaces, traffic is essentially a round the clock, almost round the clock experience of heavy traffic. We've maxed out. We're not going to build our way out of this. You can't add continually more lanes. Mass transit remains fairly illusory in Southern California. I think it's important, though, when we talk about what's been lost and what I talk about in California Twilight is that golden period, that the beautiful twilight of that golden period where you could walk down a beach in Southern California. I mentioned earlier that when we were talking, Kevin, that my wife and I had just returned from a trip up in Morro Bay, which is a beautiful little coastal village in the central California coast. And you can still really see the remnants of the state that once was up there. Though certainly changes are happening up there as well now. But in Southern California, in the late '70s and throughout the '80s, um, my family, we had a boat in the back bay of Newport Beach, and we spent a lot of time down there. And I went on a lot of dates with a lot of girls in uh, Newport Beach, where you could walk in the evening along relatively deserted beaches. And particularly in the fall, if you went down there, maybe had dinner at Woody's Wharf or the Crab Cooker on an October night. And in Southern California, October nights aren't that bad. And take a walk on the beach, and you might run into a couple, 3 people maybe. And it may not seem like much, but that was a really wonderful aspect to those times. And I think it contributed also to sort of the innocence of that time. And you may not think like 1980s in Southern California are simpatico with the term innocence, but there really was something there. And it's a shame that it's coming to an end or has come to an end. And I think the message of California Twilight is, if to the degree that you have what your parents had in communities around the rest of the nation, you really have to be vigilant as to what is happening in terms of population growth, which is fueled by mass migration, what's happening to your housing stocks, what's happening with development, because once it's gone, it's gone.
And it shouldn't be lost on anyone, the wealth inequality, because you'd mentioned the
Yeah,
Newport Beach of your youth. And I'm sure if you contrasted that to the Newport Beach of 2024, you would find that the very wealthy are able to still enjoy that kind of lifestyle. But the middle class, upper middle classes have been priced out, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. In fact, it's amazing that what you just said, because what I've noticed in a variety of lifestyle publications, including through the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and their supplemental magazines that come out over the weekend, the absolute commodification of reduced population density, that having fewer people around, they're actually marketing lines now like intentionally uncrowded, reserve, you're uncrowded
No.
reserve. So they've commodified a diminished population density. So we're facing a situation where only if you are among the very wealthy elite will you be able to enjoy a casual stroll on a beach that's not crowded. Only then will you be able to enjoy skiing down a mountain that isn't, flooded with people. Yeah, I mean, I was skiing Mammoth Mountain when I could afford the lift tickets, and I didn't
Right.
have to wait 2.5 hours in line in the '70s. I mean that, and there is something terrible to lose that. There really was accessibility. I'm not talking about things that were just exclusively for the lifestyles of the rich and famous. We all enjoyed and have the ability to enjoy as working middle class people access to that, and it's being taken away now, and has been taken away actually.
Wow, it's a real tragedy. And again, it gets back to people are homesick for a place they never left, and Californians who can seem to be voting with their feet. You look
Sure.
at the U-Haul data. I mean, as much as the governor's office is remiss to talk about it, the productive classes are leaving, and and I don't
Yeah.
know. Yeah, I don't know if that's good for the rest of the country because I can tell you they're bringing their attitudes out, to the other areas that they flock to.
Well, right. My wife and I ran into a gentleman, this is last year, up again on the Central Coast, and he was wearing his Cal Poly Slow shirt, and I was, of course, from Cal Poly Pomona. We started talking, and he was from Idaho, or he moved to Idaho, and we said, well, we're thinking about moving to either northern Washington, Utah, or Idaho, and he said, either as migrants or refugees or missionaries. And
I love
I
that.
said,
Oh
well,
my gosh.
apparently as refugees, we're not going to be there to as missionaries to expand the California way of life. Um, no, it really is. I find it fascinating, and a lot of people have asked me about this. If things are as bad as in California as certainly I'm suggesting in California Twilight, and so many other people have, then why is like Gavin Newsom being reelected as governor?
Good
Why
point.
is Karen
Right.
Bass the progressive mayor of Los Angeles? Where did George Gascon come from? Where did Chessie Boudin
Mm-hmm.
come from up in San Francisco, or London Breed? And the answer to those questions, actually, and immigration is a big part of the answer to those questions. But we had talked about this before, Kevin, the sort of the boiling frog syndrome,
Mm-hmm.
where people over a long enough period of time learn to accept and live with an eventual state that, had it been just foisted upon them immediately, they would have rebelled. But because it was instituted over a long enough timeline, once they're at where they're at, the natural state of a human lethargy, of there's not, and it's a fait accompli. What can I
Right.
really do about it now? And I think that's where we're at with immigration. Is people are are horrified when they look at a Springfield, Ohio, and see thousands and thousands of migrants appear virtually overnight. And there's a sense of, from the leadership in Ohio, Mike DeWine, and also in the White House and the Congress, of, well, it's going to be fine. Don't worry about it.
And it
Um,
won't. I mean,
no,
California back in the '90s tried with Prop 187 to, at least if nothing else, don't not to give benefits to illegal aliens, and that
Right.
was shot down. All these attempts to herd, you know, you know, keep the inevitable from
Look,
happening. If we went down this road,
look,
seems to have been upset by, you know, either corrupt or strange ideologies that are being practiced by our politicians.
the Democrats are looking to build and have built. Should the Republicans have to concede this? They've been very effective at playing the long con game on mass immigration and have built very impressive voting blocks. This previous
Right.
election aside, the numbers speak for themselves, and the outcomes speak for themselves. There are states that were once up for grabs with Republicans. California, I'm old enough to remember when California could be reliably Republican, had Republican senators,
Right.
Republican governors, and Republican presidential candidates, could win them consecutively. Those days are gone. The Republican
Mm-hmm.
Party doesn't exist in California, really at a statewide level. I don't believe that the party holds a single statewide seat. And I don't believe.
No, because
Speedy Farm,
it's actual super majorities at this point, isn't it?
that's absolutely. I'm not really sure what purpose the Republican Party serves in California other than to maintain some sort of fundraising mechanism, etc. Same thing with New York, New Jersey, places like this on the East Coast. Um, the Republicans, so the Democrats, the benefit that they've sought from mass immigration is pretty clear. It's politically, they're building a massive voting bloc. The Republicans, it's pretty clear what they see in profits from mass immigration, and that is the literal profits to their corporate benefactors, the U.S.
Right.
Chamber of Commerce crowd, that sort of mindset we've seen exemplified by Dan Crenshaw in Texas, who has stated openly that he's spoken with business leaders across the South in certain industrial sectors that say they simply can't operate their businesses without a steady flow of migrant labor, and it's very offensive. But getting back to Gavin Newsom in Los Angeles, Karen Bass, these sorts of things, I really think it does go back to how do you explain a guy like Gavin Newsom being reelected? I think he'll probably be reelected again. I don't know if I know he wants to run for the White House.
He does.
I
And I
think
think
that,
that was the intent, but they had
yeah,
gotten Biden to not run, but then Biden kind of gave them the finger by anointing Kamala Harris. And
right,
that
right.
upset the Pelosi clans, their plans.
I suspect that Newsom was probably relieved that he didn't try to grab the brass ring this time. But I think he's positioned to attempt so in 2028. But again, going back to California, how can California be in such a state of decline with such widespread despair? The homeless situation, of course, is out of
Right.
control.
Out of control.
Crime
Always
is out of
was.
control. And, they continue to attempt to address it by saying, well, it's not as bad as it looks. It's not as bad as it seems. This statistic, that study, et cetera, et cetera. But people understand. They believe their gut. They believe their heart. They believe their own eyes. They understand, hey, it wasn't like this 5 years ago. And 5 years ago, it wasn't like it was 10 years before that. So we understand what's going on. I do think, though, there is a bit of the boiling frog syndrome at play here, that the Democrats have built up what I call basically disaster-proof margins. That it doesn't matter. There is no bottom. There is no break. There is no end. There's no point. I mean, Gascon lost, and that's says something. That's a good sign. But whether that can be replicated across the state, I'm not sure at all.
Yeah,
And
yeah. To me, it was almost a good thing, and I believe there was a lot of treachery involved in Trump not being elected in 2020. But I think what happened, like you look at Pennsylvania is a great example. We had it was an amazing get out the vote. I mean, the Amish are a very small community. There's only about 87,000 here in Pennsylvania, but they were voting because I live right across from the county building, and I would watch Amish going in to early vote. And I was when I left for D.C. that evening, or about 5 o'clock. I had visited. I live in the city of Lancaster, and it's a very blue city. And I didn't notice when I swung by the voting booth unusual crowds or anything. But from the county, which is very red, there were hour and a half waiting lines for people to vote, and they were not giving up. So I think what happened was the American people really took things back. And if there's any lesson to be learned here, and in California, people are simply going to have to organize. You might have to fire everyone in the Republican Party and come up with a real opposition party to all of this.
Well, certainly that's a real possibility in terms of the last guy I think that had a real clear shot at it was Ross Perot.
And who I actually worked for 2 years.
Yeah, Perot was a fascinating guy when he came out. Sure you remember at first it was called United We Stand.
Right.
And I think it was Pat Caddell. I don't know if you remember him, but the Democratic operative.
Right, yes.
I think Pat wrote the Malaise speech for Carter. That was didn't turn out so well. But the Caddell, I think it was Caddell that noted that Ross Perot was drawing support from Jesse Helms voters and Howard Metzenbaum voters, and there was no way a coalition like that could hold together for long. But Perot did very well had he not had that mid-cycle.
Yeah, because the
dropout.
exit polling indicated that had he not done the in and out, he would have gotten like 34.3% of the vote, and that would have been enough in a three-way race to give him the presidency.
I mean, the Stockdale stumble, the in and out. He made some unforced errors.
Well, do you want to know the history? Well, the story, the backstory on Stockdale.
Well, my understanding was he was supposed to be a placeholder. And,
that's exactly it. Yeah, because when Perot did the in and out, no one else was going to come in.
Right.
And so Stockdale, being the good soldier he is, stuck it out. And
Right. So anyway, will the Republicans turn the corner on this? Will sensible Democrats join them? I don't know. It's difficult to see what can be done if this next 4 years, and really the next two, I think we have until 26, while the GOP still has three chambers to work with, the White House, the Senate, and the House. If they don't move decisively, and that's what we're talking about now, half measures aren't going to accomplish anything of substance. So if they don't move decisively to effectively close the border, not just better manage or organize the mass migration across it, but close it, effectively close it, right? Then and begin a serious, sustained, and very publicly perceptible campaign of deportations, workplace raids, workplace enforcement, E-Verify, across the board, which really sends, along with everything else, the kind of message that needs to be sent. Then I don't know. It's difficult to imagine what happens after that you could turn the ship around if the next 2 to 4 years are squandered. So,
absolutely. And, on that note, we have reached our hour. This has gone really fast, Mark. The book, once again, California Twilight. Let me get that in focus there. End of the Golden State by Mark Ray Cromer. Now, Mark, do you blog or anything like that?
Well, I do. Actually, I have a blog, thecromerreader.com. And for California Twilight, it's available online at Amazon.com in all formats, both Kindle, hardback, and paperback, and also Barnes & Noble. And in both formats. And it's also available in other online book retailers like Books A Million and whatnot. But Wild Blue Press, wildbluepress.com. They're a great independent publishing house in Colorado. You can pick it up there, and they've got a lot of other great titles to look at. And thecromerreader.com is my blog. When I get around to it, it's non-commercial and just my perspective on things. Kevin, thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you, Mark, and I want to thank our audience for staying with us this long. You're real always. I have a great audience, and we will be posting this directly now to X. We used to post only directly to YouTube, but the way things have changed is we post directly to X, YouTube, Rumble. We get a lot of play on X, and so that's why we upload directly there to our Institute for Sound Public Policy page. But we also have our U.S. tech workers and our Project for Immigration Reform group there as well. And again, to our audience, if you enjoyed this segment, give it a thumbs up, give it a like, because that tells the algorithm that this is content our audience wants to interact with. And be sure to subscribe as well, because that way you'll be kept informed every time we do another great interview like we have today. Again, Mark, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon, and really looking forward to when you're preparing for an interview, you kind of speed read through a book, but I will be going through this much more in depth here in the next couple of weeks.
Well, terrific. And thank you so much for having me, and look forward to coming back whenever we have the chance.
Fantastic. Thanks again.
Thanks, Kevin.